Hello there, I'm Jane. I'm a watercolor artist. Welcome to this new video series in partnership with Strathmore. In the following 4 lessons, we'll be exploring different ways to fill in your watercolor sketchbook. For me personally, keeping a watercolor sketchbook is very important. It helps me to evolve my own personal style, and it is a safe zone to experiment with different mediums and approaches. So my goal here is to show you more examples and approaches in every lesson. And rather than always trying to paint a perfect piece, it is about practicing different techniques and searching for ideas. In this first lesson, we will explore botanical and floral motifs. So let's get started. Before we start the lesson, let me show you the art materials I'll be using throughout. For drawing, I will use Rembrandt Art Design pencils in HB and 2B and a Lyra kneaded eraser, as this one is gentle to the watercolor paper. I will also sometimes sketch with Rembrandt Aquarelle. These are watercolor pencils, and I will show you the advantages of sketching with these later in the video. The actual sketchbook that we're going to be filling together is Strathmore Watercolor Art Journal 400 series. This one is in A4 size. Paper is 300 GSM and it holds a lot of water. This paper is amazing for explorations with different mediums, different approaches. You'll also need a metallic clip to hold the pages and prevent buckling. Next important material are the brushes. I will show you which I prefer to use, but we will do some exercises with them later in the video to get to know them better. This one is Watercolor from the Princeton Neptune line. It is amazing for large washes, and like all Neptune brushes, it has incredibly soft and thirsty bristles, which is great for watercolor techniques. These two are also Princeton Neptune. One is dagger and the other one oval wash. They have different shapes which we will benefit from while exploring a wide variety of techniques. Here we have Princeton Aqua Elite brushes. These are also very useful for watercolor, but have a little stiffer bristles, which I find incredibly helpful when in the need to draw precise detail or lift paint. I use long round, dagger and stroke. Last 2 brushes are a liner and a round Velvetouch brush. I will demonstrate their use in the first demo. Special materials to create watercolor effects are alcohol and table salt. Alcohol is just a disinfectant. Anything with at least 50% alcohol will work just fine. There is also masking tape and washi tape to create borders and separate sketchbook sheets, and there is a spray bottle with clean water and paper towels. I'll also be using Aquafine Studio set of 48 beautiful watercolors in pans and also a few tubes of MaimeriBlu artist grade watercolor. I will introduce individual colors in the following demo. And now we're ready to start painting. Starting a new sketchbook can be intimidating. You might feel some hesitation and fear of ruining this beautiful book, but when you get through the first couple of pages and properly break it in, you can completely relax and explore. And so our first demo painting today will be a quick and easy one. We will paint expressive and colorful dandelions to our first page. I use masking tape to create border around pages, and washi tape is great to use for that middle part of your sketchbook because it doesn't rip the paper when removing. If you're using watercolor pens, make sure to use spray bottle on them. The paint will soften and will be easier to work with. My setup before painting include pulling out all my brushes, keeping paper towels at hand, as well as all the tools and supplies. I recommend you use 2 jars of water instead of just 1. I try to keep 1 jar with clean water so that I don't mix my paints with dirty water. Let's start by planning out which colors we want to use. I suggest that we explore some variations of pink and purples, then maybe some yellows and some greens in this first sketch. You will often see me taking these visual notes on the other side of the sketchbook, and since sketchbook is about exploration, these notes later on help me with developing larger works and find color combinations that I really like. I also don't hesitate to use pages of the art journal for actual technical exercises, so some pages might appear messy while other pages hold nice and clean artwork. I encourage you to do the same and treat your sketchbook as a safe zone for even scribbles, mess-ups, notes. Just be free with your process. I used Watercolor brush to pre-wet the entire page, and then I started to place colors on the page. Adding color into wet area allows the paint to spread and then they can mingle with the other colors. One tip here is to start with the lighter colors and then add darker colors later on. I placed masking tape under the sketchbook to create a slight tilt. This will help for the excess water to run down the page instead of creating pools across the page. But sometimes the excess water isn't the problem because sometimes wash dries way too quickly. If this is the case, then make sure that you are using enough water with the paint that you are adding. And lastly, I'm adding purple color, and at this stage this is just an underpainting that looks like a huge mess, but it will shortly come together. When all the colors are finally placed, I'm dipping my brush into the prepared alcohol and then paint circles with this medium. These will be the heads of our dandelions. On top of this, I'm sprinkling some table salt to the wet paint, and now we let this dry. Please note that both of these effects only work with wet paint. You will not get this if your wash already dried. Just make sure that you are using sufficient amounts of water during the first phase. Now the wash is dried and salt created beautiful crystallic effect. Sometimes the alcohol effect is beautifully isolated from the paint, and other times like today it needs more work. I used oval wash brush to paint a lighter green wash around the dandelion heads. We need to pay some attention to the edges. Around the dandelions we want hard and crisp edges, but this new wash of paint needs to nicely merge into the background, and oval wash brush is perfect for this. I just dip it in clean water and then use it to soften the unwanted edges. Some edges can also be diffused with spray bottle. Now that we have all this cleaned up and dry, it is time to draw some stems. I find the liner brush perfect for this. Stems don't have to be super straight. In fact, a more shaken line looks more natural. You can also practice adding some leaves to the painting. First, draw a line and then try to use your oval wash brush or dagger brush as a stump like this to create different shapes of leaves. This is a really fun technique, and after a few trials you'll get the hang of it. Just make sure to really press the brush that holds the paint against the page of your sketchbook and then observe the resulting imprint. I practiced a little bit and now I want to add these elements into the painting. First I draw a small dot to the center of my dandelions and then add stems to them. I want the stems to cross each other just a little bit. There is no particular rule here. Try to place them as it feels harmonious to you. I will now try to add a couple of leaves to the painting. I will find some space for them at the bottom part of my painting. Normally, I enjoy doing this technique with oval wash brush, but it depends on the size of your painting, and today the dagger was a little better because it is smaller. I want to now show you the lifting technique, and for this I will use the Aqua Elite stroke brush with stiffer bristles. I dip the brush in clean water and then I rub different areas of my painting to lift some pigment off the page. When the pigment softens and dissolves, I lift it with a tissue. This is fun and efficient for bringing some highlights back into the painting. You can even use this to basically draw light veins into the leaves. I use dagger brush to create some splatters, and this is another lovely effect to enrich your watercolor paintings. And here is our first artwork. So this was our warm-up. Now let's try another botanical motif. For this sunflower study, we'll use a reference image, and I will lightly sketch this on the page with Lyra pencil. I don't actually create detailed drawings for these watercolor artworks, but I like to have at least some important landmarks planned out and positioned on the page. Here I mainly focus on positioning the dark flower centers, and this can have a bolder outline because the paint will cover this. In contrast, the yellow parts of the flower don't need a complete outline. Just a suggestion of the edge here and there will be sufficient because we will paint these by trying out different brush imprints. The pencil marks around the yellow paint would be visible too much. You can sketch these freehand or trace my sketch for this demo. You can find both the sketch and the reference image in the instructions sheet down below. Let's find some suitable colors for this demo, and I want to use different shades of green with light blue, 2 shades of yellow. We might also want to use browns for the centers. I want to show you a great way to do sketches of botanical motifs. This technique will utilize brushes with different shapes. The idea is to try out your brushes and paint a single brush strokes with them to see what kind of shapes you are getting. So my dagger brush produces these sharper shapes, while my Velvetouch round brush produces rounder strokes that will be very suitable for the actual sunflower leaves. I also tried the Aqua Elite long round brush, and these last results I find very handy for the leaves. I encourage you to explore different shapes that all of your brushes produce and then observe the reference to see which parts can be interpreted with which kind of brushstroke. You can actually build a whole painting using this method. Let's paint in the yellow parts of the sunflower now. I will be using the Velvetouch round brush for this. Sometimes I use more than just a single brushstroke to paint one flower petal, and that's okay. My tip is to paint a bit more loosely, keep the paint watery. It should still flow a little on the page when you lay it down. I'm adding darker yellow to the bottom parts of these flower petals to indicate some light changes. Here, I'm leaving out some highlights here and there, randomly distributed across the petals, and this creates a lovely effect, and optically, the watercolor study will breathe a little thanks to this. Flower on the left is a little bit further away, so I want to paint it a bit more loosely. I'm using dagger brush as these brush strokes will be a little sharper. Here I'm also mixing in more greens and blues into the yellow paint to indicate the distance. I want to paint the brown centers before the yellow paint dries because I like this effect when the colors bleed into one another. You might feel like it's out of control, but watercolor definitely looks more free and artistic thanks to these effects. I'm adding a few random splatters of yellow paint and I'm ready to paint the stems and the leaves. Usually I try to paint everything in one go, not caring that much about paint mingling, but if you still want to separate one wet area from another, you can leave out some white space between them. We can now paint some leaves with different types of green and blue. I'm leaving out some highlights here as well as I go. As an exercise, try to draw some leaves on the other side of the sketchbook. Leaf shapes are easy enough, but depending on what brush you are using, you are going to get either rounder or sharper shapes of your leaves. Try to pick brushes that hold more water for this exercise. Another tip is really to try to vary the type of green you are using to prevent that your study looks too flat. You can mix yellows in your greens and these leaves might look a bit closer to the flowers. The color will be looking fresh and vibrant. And when I mix blue into my green and water down the mixture, I get leaves that appear further back as if they were disappearing into the background. So that's a fun thing to try. Try to leave out some highlights here and there if you can. I try for these to look like veins, but it doesn't always work out. Important is to work with watery and flowy paint because after a while that paint settles down and the extra moisture helps to build a beautiful crisp edges on your watercolor shapes. Great thing about this approach is that you don't have to follow some rigid outline or sketch, which is why I only sketched a few important landmarks at the start and not everything. You can add stems or loose leafy shapes as you wish and as many as you feel that is needed for the sketch. Here we go, the first layer is done and we let this dry now. In a bit we can add second layer just to some parts to create few more details. You can now practice few lines with me. I'm using Aqua Elite Pointed Round Brush for this, but liner brush is fine as well. First, details to add will be some separation between the yellow sunflower petals. Try not to simply frame the petal with dark brown color, but rather indicate the darkest points between two petals. The darkest point is usually where the petals meet the brown center, but can also be somewhere at the top. I just make it a rule not to use a single line here, but rather an interrupted line or dots as this looks more natural. Oh, and not all the petals need separating. The central flower will have more details and therefore needs more work, but the flower on the left, for example, I do not separate its petals at all. Here I'm adding a bit of a shading to the petals. This is darker yellow with a bit of brown, watered down, and I'm just indicating a little change in tone with a single brushstroke. Here I'm again darkening some parts of the brown center. Rest of this flower will stay as it is now. Flower on the right still needs some work, but not as much as the central flower. Just remember, the main goal with these sketches is to explore the subject and get used to the brushes. I sometimes tend to forget this and end up detailing a subject for hours, only to find out later that I overworked and spoiled the spontaneous watercolor effect. So for today I'm stopping because I think as far as sunflowers go, I got the point across already, so here is our second demo. But let's cover one more subject, and this time with a full background, and let's use plenty of fresh and vibrant color. I chose my favorite poppies, and I want to show you a rather free and very enjoyable approach. I'll use MaimeriBlu paints in Indian Yellow, Cadmium Red Light, Permanent Carmine, Magenta, Potter's Pink, Payne's Grey, and Cobalt Green. There are all highly pigmented and gorgeous artist-grade paints to work with, and two of these have nice granulation effect, and that is Potter's Pink and Cobalt Green. Granulation shows as a texture of a paint instead of being smooth. I personally love to use it to add more texture to plant stems or leaves or even to flower petals. For sketch, I'll use Rembrandt Aquarelle pencils. These are watercolor pencils and they're a great option to use in a regular graphite pencil. If you sketch with watercolor pencils and then build your painting on top, the original sketch lines will dissolve and you won't have to deal with a visible graphite outline. So I'll quickly plan out and sketch this subject, but you'll be surprised how few lines are actually needed. It might look complex at first glance. I just want to know where to position the two largest flowers so that I have still some room for the background and rest of the floral elements that are not in focus. You can again find the reference as well as my sketch in the instructions sheet down below. I want to first practice and show you this wet in wet technique. First, pre-wet some area with large brush and clean water. Now in this wet area, we will try to draw a simple shape of the orange and then the red poppy. No details, just a large blob of paint that's shaped like a poppy. Now you can draw a yellow center of the poppy and then fill the rest of the shape with red paint. This approach results in our paint blurring out and it will appear soft and will not have such defined edges even when it dries. This is completely different from a previous demo when we benefited from the crisp hard edges of the brushstrokes. You can even use the spray bottle to make the paint run wild. I will now grab darker red paint and before this dries, I try to indicate some shadows inside the flower. Here I want to show you how you can still get a clean silhouette of the flower if you needed it, and that's with negative painting technique. The idea is that if you paint another flower next to this one or a dark background on a dry surface, this creates the separation between the blurred out poppy and the rest of the painting. When you get the hang of these few techniques, you can paint anything with ease. They are incredibly powerful and fun. So let's practice this in the actual poppy painting. I will pre-wet the entire page using my Princeton modeler brush, and then I'll start laying down paint with oval wash brush because we need to be able to fill in large areas quite quickly. I like to start with lighter colors and then adding darker ones as I go. I'm working with Indian yellow here first and mixing in a bit of that cobalt green. With the tip of my brush, I'm drawing in dots to indicate the small yellow parts of the flower center. Just notice how everything spreads. This effect is so typical for watercolor and it creates beautiful results. I'm re-wetting the page if it feels like it dried too quickly, and then I continue adding the red paint. Main tip here is again to tilt your sketchbook, place masking tape or something under it so that the excess water can flow towards the bottom of the page. It is easier to control the flow of the paint this way because when you have pools of stagnant water on the page, that's very difficult. While this paint is still wet, let's paint in some shadows. Let's take a look at the reference photo and find these areas that are a bit darker. I try to roughly paint these shadows in a simple brushstroke each, and it's really not necessary to focus on a precise shape, just defining some major tonal differences here. You can observe how the paint spreads, and when you squint your eyes a little or look at your painting from a distance, you will already see that there is a flower there. Now we will use the same principle to block in the rest of the colors, mainly representing the peripheral flowers. I'm re-wetting those areas again to make sure that the surface is damp, and then I draw in these shapes with Potter's Pink, Magenta and Carmine colors. Each blob of paint will represent one flower. It is as simple as that. Here I'm removing some of the pigment with my oval wash brush to preserve some light. You can also use the lifting technique, but you have to wait until the wash dries for that. I used Potter's Pink for this light pink flower and I want to draw in the shadows now. For this I will mix just a bit of cobalt green into the Potter's Pink, then I will draw in the actual shadows. Here is one specific detail we want to explore and practice, and that's the center of the flower. There is a light green star-like shape, like you can see on the reference photo. I will use the negative painting technique to get this light shape to stand out. So with my dagger brush, I draw those darker shadows around it. Then I add some lines and dots to indicate the structure of the center, and this is how we simplify but also get a quite descriptive look to our sketches. This last technique is called dry brush, and it helps you to add more contrasty lines to the flower. I prefer soft brushes for this, and the Neptune dagger brush is a star and it really nails down this technique. Look at just how effective this is when adding permanent Carmine brushstrokes to this flower. It makes it stand out so much in just a couple of seconds. So try this yourself, and then we can add these approaches to the actual painting on the right. Here we nail down the negative painting around the light green centers. Both of these central flowers need some detail in their center. We need to draw some lines around the centers, and the red flower will have clear red lines between the yellow parts. After you drew the details, it is time for dry brush, and you can add generous amount of paint to your brush for this, as we want to create more contrast. Here I'm adding some contrast for the pink flower using a bit more intense mixture of potter's pink, permanent carmine with a hint of cobalt green. I use the hatching and dry brushing here too, but it is not as dark and contrasty as with the main red poppy. Here I'm adding parts of some stems with lighter green paint, and this is mostly just to indicate where they are so that I can negatively paint around them when adding the dark background soon. For the background, I'm mixing permanent carmine with Payne's gray, and this will be the final step that glues everything together. I'll paint this wet on dry, but will use spray bottle to diffuse some edges later on. Interesting about painting the background is the fact that you are actually painting the shapes of the background flowers for the first time. We are now focused to observe the negative shapes in our reference photo and draw them in. And by doing this, the flowers will suddenly appear. Here I want to diffuse these edges, and so I will use a spray bottle when I place the paint down. Sometimes hard edges are useful, especially when you want to describe something like the flower in the center, but other times they still focus from the center, so that is why the diffusion creates more balance in your composition. Here around the green stems, I want to paint just a bit more carefully because I'd like to preserve these areas as a bit lighter. Then I will slowly paint all the dark shapes of the background that I feel that we need to separate the flowers. I also make sure that I diffuse all the edges on the peripheral parts of the painting. Here is a couple of shadows I want to include, so I mix carmine with Payne's gray and basically paint the shape of the shadow with an oval wash brush. So this is the stage of the painting process where I really have to think and decide when it's finished. We can keep on adding details for 2 more hours if we wish. The paper can handle this, but will the painting become better? And that's the question that every artist has to ask themselves and make a clear line. Sometimes I feel that even a peripheral flower deserves more shading, or that I want to lift some pigment to return more light into the piece. Other times I enjoy slightly unfinished look to the parts that are not important to me, in contrast with my clearly focused center. So I encourage you to experiment and find your own balance here. Finally, I'm removing the tape, and here is our last finished sketchbook artwork. And I will see you in another lesson soon where we will explore landscape and scenery motifs together.